Whenever I see people talking about the Khmer Rouge online, whether that's in other YouTube videos, places like Reddit, blogs, or even the comment section for my own podcast, I tend to see similar trends in what people like to chuck out there as hard facts or truths about Pol Pot's murderous regime. Some of these facts you see are commonly repeated cliches, shared with no real bad intent, like the old idea that Vikings wore horned helmets or that Marie Antoinette said let them eat cake. So it should be no surprise that a complicated historical period like the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge would have its own versions of these cliches based on overly simplified premises or incorrect information. And then we also have people sharing facts about the regime that come from very biased views of this history. These come from people trying to make the story fit their political views, and while they might contain the odd kernel of truth, they generally serve to distort what actually happened. And lastly, you'll also be sharing the occasional opinion or fact which is completely removed from the actual history, to the extent that it is denying aspects of the story ever took place, or radically inserting different motives and shifting blame elsewhere, more or less in the same category as Holocaust denial or conspiracy theory. So what I'm doing in this video is just giving you a top 10 list of these cliches or facts which I often see shared online. I'm going to break them down a bit and explain why they're either misunderstood, distort the story, or the examples of outright denial, like I said. Some of these you've probably seen, maybe you've even said them yourself, while others are definitely out there on the fringes. We're going to get started with probably one of the most commonly heard claims about the Khmer Rouge that you'll see in books, movies, documentaries, news stories, and just about everywhere else. Pol Pot declared year zero. Everyone has heard this one, right? When the topic of Pol Pot or the Khmer Rouge comes up, you will inevitably see something along the lines of, once the Khmer Rouge took control of Phnom Penh, that's when Pol Pot declared year zero had begun. You can see it here on Wikipedia, here it is in a BBC article, and here is John Pilger saying it a few times in his very influential documentary from 1979.
The rulers of Cambodia call 1975 year zero.
From year zero.
And if you look at the sources used for something like the Wikipedia article, you'll see that they just say that Pilger said it, or they'll reference a news article. So you've got a kind of citation loop. But the thing is, there is no record of the Khmer Rouge or Pol Pot ever having used the phrase. It was not heard on their radio broadcasts, it was not printed in their propaganda magazine, nor was it heard by those who lived through the regime. It certainly wasn't said by Pol Pot when the Khmer Rouge took complete control over Cambodia either. Anyone who knows anything about the regime will tell you that Pol Pot was famously secretive, and his identity as the leader was still concealed from view outside of the party in 1975. So why does everyone still say that Pol Pot declared year zero? Well, I actually wrote a whole article about this that you can read on my Substack, but the short version is that this phrase, year zero, was imposed on the history from the outside, and has basically just stuck ever since. Take for instance the aforementioned documentary by John Pilger. It was called Year Zero, and he isn't shy about claiming it was basically the Khmer Rouge's branding for their whole terrible time in power. It is likely, however, that Pilger simply borrowed the phrase from another highly influential expose of the regime that came out just before the regime fell, Francois Ponchaud's book, Cambodia, Year Zero. It's definitely a great title. It evokes all kinds of ideas like resetting society in the same vein as the French revolutionaries and the Great Terror. However, most people don't realise that he never actually used the phrase year zero within the book itself. If you read the article I wrote, you'll know I go into the reasons why someone like Ponchaud chose the title, and perhaps some different reasons why Pilger was so eager to repeat it about 20 times in his documentary. For instance, I think Pilger, who had his own political bias, to put it mildly, was keen to make out that the Cambodian Revolution was something that hadn't been seen before. It was an attempt to go back to the Stone Age, as opposed to the Khmer Rouge following some pretty clear-cut examples from previous socialist regimes, but with an extra radical agenda. Which is what I would say is my kind of issue with using the phrase with no extra context. Some people have come to the opinion that the Khmer Rouge were some kind of radical primitive movement, trying to keep Cambodia in some distant past. This is a vast oversimplification of their ideology. What they really wanted to do was create a communist society in record time, propelling Cambodia through the stages of economic evolution as fast as they could, in order to achieve some kind of perfect, self-sustaining society and a return to Cambodian greatness. A much better phrase to associate with the revolution was the one that Henry Locard emphasized in his collection of all of the common phrases that were heard during the regime. That the Khmer Rouge wanted a super great leap forward, like Mao's China, only better. The term, the Cambodian Genocide. Okay, so this is another one that everyone is familiar with. It's used in academic circles as well as by survivors in Cambodia and everyone in between. It is the most common way to refer to what happened under the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian Genocide. However, the general application of this term is disagreed with by a few leading scholars who don't feel that it should be used to describe the totality of the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. Now that might shock some people, and I actually made a whole video just on this topic, so please check that out for a more detailed breakdown. And please check it out before having a knee-jerk reaction to this, because it is a complicated discussion that requires some attention be paid to what I'm saying. So I'm going to have to be very clear, because this does tend to set people off just a little bit. There are different understandings of the term genocide. It has a general use in, the average person in the public, what they think genocide means. And it also has come to have different academic definitions, where certain scholars have said, well, this is maybe what genocide should mean. Most of which basically relay the idea that when a group or a government decides to systematically murder a large number of people, well, people will generally just start to call that genocide. But what's crucial here is that this general public view, or the academic stretching of that definition, is not as exact as the legal definition, as in the actual crime of genocide, as it was written into the UN Genocide Convention, the international treaty which criminalizes that act and obliges its prohibition and persecution. That's very important to remember, that genocide is a crime that you can be tried for in a court. And here is the relevant definition of that crime, as it applies to Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group. Okay, so if you're following me so far, there are very specific criteria to be met for a person or government to be accused and prosecuted for the crime of genocide, rather than just they killed a bunch of people. Think of this like the legal difference between, say, murder 1 and manslaughter. Both crimes involve someone's death, but they differ on the intent and applicable law. Now, the reason why some historians don't agree with using the term the Cambodian Genocide is because the vast majority of the crimes that were committed by the Khmer Rouge do not fit the UN definition of genocide. In other words, they were not committed against an ethnic, racial, or religious group with the intent to destroy that group based on having that characteristic. The death toll under the Khmer Rouge in their 4 years in power was just over 2 million people. Probably more than half that number were the result of direct executions and state-sponsored murders. The other half were most likely deaths that resulted from overwork, exposure to the elements, sickness, disease, and malnutrition. Obviously, those deaths are still the result of the Khmer Rouge Revolution's policies, so they're still attributed to their crimes. However, if we just stick to the murders, what we are looking at isn't just Cambodians killing other Cambodians. The reason why that isn't genocide isn't that simple. It's the fact that they were being killed because they were political enemies of the Khmer Rouge. They were not targeted on the basis of their race, ethnicity, or religion. They were targeted because they were in some way or another deemed to be enemies of the revolution. Therefore, it wasn't their Cambodianness that meant they were killed, which means that it was not technically genocide, because the intent cannot be established to kill these people on that basis. Now, this can get more complicated because you might hear all of that and say, okay, but the Khmer Rouge leaders were convicted of genocide. And you're exactly right. In 2018, that decision was handed down by the Khmer Rouge tribunals, and Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan were convicted of genocide. However, what is crucial to recognise is that they were found guilty of genocide against two discrete ethnic groups: the minority of the Vietnamese that remained in the country during the revolution, and the Muslim Cham minority. In these two cases, the prosecutors were able to prove the intent that the Khmer Rouge leadership had on killing these groups because they were Vietnamese, or in the case of the Chams, largely because of their ethnicity and their religious affiliation. So I realise some people might find this overly pedantic, but you would be correct to say that the Khmer Rouge were guilty of genocide. You could even call them genocidal. However, what some people have an issue with is calling the entire period the Cambodian Genocide, because these two victim groups, the Vietnamese and the Chams, only make up something close to 5% of the entire death toll. And as I've said, the vast majority of those who died were Cambodians. Now, this is one of these that really kind of can come down to just your personal views. If someone says the Cambodian Genocide, it's not like someone's going to pull you up and say, hey, it's not called that. It has generally just become what the period has been called for the better part of 45 years. Nonetheless, it is one of those things that is usually said without really knowing the context behind the phrase, and that some historians think that it's a misrepresentation of what happened. In other words, if 95% of the death toll doesn't fit the legal definition of the crime, why are we using the phrase the Cambodian Genocide? As David Chandler once told me, it's basically because the common understanding is that what happened in Cambodia was so bad that it just must have been genocide, because genocide has come to mean the worst thing that can happen, despite the legal definition of that term. If you watch the full video I made on this topic, you'll see that another legal term, crimes against humanity, much better fits the general character of the Khmer Rouge evils inflicted upon Cambodia, including their enslavement of the population, forced work, forced marriages, and dehumanization of everyone under their control. And indeed, that was what the surviving leaders were convicted of in court in relation to the majority of crimes that they committed. Next, the US paved the way for the Khmer Rouge. This is one of those claims that gets thrown around so casually and so often that for many people it's just been accepted as fact. The United States paved the way for the Khmer Rouge to take power. Now, you'd be crazy to suggest that the various policies of the United States across the period in question had no impact on the rise of the Khmer Rouge, and that is certainly not my position. The US definitely did things in Cambodia or that affected the country that were really terrible and were part of the story of the Khmer Rouge getting to power. However, what I will say is that there is a tendency to exclude all the other actors in this story. It suggests that there was just one real cause to these events, which is wildly out of proportion with the full story. It's not good historical analysis. It might feel good to put the blame somewhere, but it doesn't actually have much explanatory power. Yes, the United States bombed Cambodia. Yes, Nixon and Kissinger supported the Lon Nol regime, which was corrupt and weak. And yes, in the biggest sweeping counterfactual sense, if there was no Vietnam War, there wouldn't have been a Khmer Rouge quite like we saw come to power, quite like they did. But counterfactuals aren't history, they're hypotheticals, and that one in particular doesn't take much of the rest of the story into account either. The story of the Khmer Rouge began long before Nixon and Kissinger. listeners to the podcast will know that things that are often talked about in very simplistic ways, like the coup against Sihanouk in 1970, actually had a long and complicated series of events which led up to that point. The idea that it was a US-backed coup against Sihanouk has no actual evidence and doesn't take into account the economic chaos, political fractures, and peasant unrest in the country leading up to that point for years. Again, years where Cambodia had actually cut off ties with the United States, and long before Nixon was in the White House. So when we talk about the bombing of Cambodia, or the coup against Sihanouk destabilising the country and bringing the Khmer Rouge to power, which is usually what people are insinuating, there never seems to be any room in that calculation for the other major actors in the story. For instance, there is usually no mention of the more than 50,000 communist Vietnamese troops in Cambodia at that time, which played a central role in Sihanouk's removal from power, not by a CIA plot, but by his own ministers and government that feared his accommodation of the Vietnamese was threatening the country with disaster. The secret US bombing of Cambodia in 1969 and the subsequent carpet bombing from 1970 to 1973, this isn't talked about as having the aim of destroying these bases of Vietnamese communists who had been using Cambodian land to achieve their own war effort in South Vietnam. People will usually just quote this book, Sideshow, by William Shawcross, or at least the title of the book, when talking about this period of the story and the bad effects of Nixon's policies. But they don't often extend this idea that Cambodia was a sideshow to the United States war in Vietnam, which by some measure is true, and I accept that. But they rarely keep following that momentum to say, well, Cambodia was also a sideshow to the communist Vietnamese, happy to use the land and build their supply trails through a neutral country, opening up these areas as targets for the Americans because the Vietnamese wanted to win their war. If the armies of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were not in Cambodia, do you think that the Americans would have bombed Cambodia? And this is the kind of thing I'm trying to get at by digging deeper into this idea that the US paved the way for the Khmer Rouge. Because you know who else paved the way for the Khmer Rouge? The communist Vietnamese. They essentially invented the idea of Cambodian communism in the early 1950s and created a communist party there as a means to fight the war against the French. They trained their cadres, armed them, basically creating the Khmer Rouge army later in the early 1970s. They fought most of the battles that opened up the majority of the Cambodian countryside for the resistance against the Lon Nol regime, and then they handed all of that territory over for the Khmer Rouge to administer. And people talk about the bombing having this massive effect on the recruitment of the Khmer Rouge, as if it was the only factor. I'm not saying it didn't have any effect at all, it definitely did, but this, again, oversimplifies things. There's no mention of Sihanouk who, after he was removed from power, well, he could have retired to a nice house in Monaco to make his music and movies and live like a prince. But he didn't. He joined forces with the communists, China and the Vietnamese, and the Khmer Rouge, and he urged as many of his fellow Cambodians to join the resistance and bring him back to power. A call to arms taken up by thousands. This had just as much of an effect on recruitment as the US bombing, if not more so. But instead, we just get this straight line reasoning that America is so bad, they created the Khmer Rouge. Except they didn't. They didn't create the ideology of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. That was influenced by Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and the Vietnamese. The Chinese armed and financed the Khmer Rouge all the way to power, and then after. This narrative also leaves no room for the Cambodians themselves, the disastrous policies of Lon Nol or Sihanouk who governed the country before him, let alone the agency of the Khmer Rouge leadership who committed their crimes against humanity. When we stop the story at the US is to blame, we remove the agency of everyone else who was instrumental in bringing this movement into existence and carrying it to power. Now, please don't take this as a defense of US foreign policy, like the bombing of Cambodia. It was morally indefensible. killed thousands of civilians and did tremendous ecological and social damage. But the rise of the Khmer Rouge cannot simply be boiled down to one single causal thread. I also had a long article published on this topic, so please read it if you'd like this to be expanded on. This topic itself could be talked about for an hour, and this is what we do on the podcast. We spent multiple episodes on this topic, so we've talked about this for about 3 hours. So if you want that kind of nuanced, balanced view of history of the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge, you should be listening to In the Shadows of Utopia on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's a story that can't quite be explained in half an hour or even 4 hours with the occasional cute animal stories or comedic breaks included. It deserves more than that, in my opinion. The Khmer Rouge killed everyone with glasses. You will have no doubt seen this one, another classic that is endlessly typed out in comment sections or shared as a defining feature of the Khmer Rouge regime. When I was in Dallas once, I went to the Holocaust Museum there, and at the end of it they had a little booth set up for the other genocides, and each one was kind of decorated in a way to evoke the killings. And the one for the Khmer Rouge had dozens of glasses sort of hanging down off the string from the display. Likewise, I once saw a video on YouTube explaining the Khmer Rouge, and it had, like 1 million views. And it was mostly just stuff from Wikipedia, but the host did decide to include something which I found a little odd that isn't on Wikipedia. I'm not sure where they got it from. But they stated that
the main museum of the killing fields in Cambodia holds piles of glasses.
There's a display with hundreds of pairs of eyeglasses all piled up in it, just like the piles of victims' shoes displayed at a place like Auschwitz. So again, I want to stress that that person just made that up, which is interesting because it's got millions of views, but whatever. But overall, what this kind of says is that if you're aware of the Khmer Rouge, you've probably got this meme in your head that they killed everyone with glasses. And for whatever reason, this YouTube video wanted to emphasize that and make up their own little fact. And the idea that the Khmer Rouge killed everyone with glasses, this is based in a truth, but it is an oversimplification, although with reason. Elizabeth Becker best explains this in her book, When the War Was Over. Refugees said Cambodians wearing eyeglasses were killed because the Khmer Rouge thought only intellectuals wore eyeglasses. These were exaggerations, but they were exaggerations such as are fables, based on a truth too awful to explain. The eyeglass fable reflected how the Khmer Rouge had targeted intellectuals as dangerous and killed thousands for simply having an education. As Becker eloquently explains, this idea that the Khmer Rouge killed everyone with glasses speaks to a more complicated truth. It's a simple way of stating something much deeper, that amongst those that were more likely to be considered enemies of the Khmer Rouge regime were those from more privileged backgrounds who often had higher educations, which would likely have put them into more contact with the aspects of the previous society that were antithetical to Khmer Rouge rule. In essence, someone who was educated was more likely to be of a bad class background and therefore less likely to be an obedient participant in the revolution. These people died in higher rates than those who had backgrounds that were closer to the Khmer Rouge's ideal, the poor peasant farmer class. Now, all of that is not to say that the Khmer Rouge leadership literally sat down at a meeting and said, okay, we're writing up a list of people we want our cadres in the villages to find and kill. Number 1, anyone who wears glasses. The directives of the party were often quite vague, relentlessly pressing the need to root out enemies and spies. And this was often left up to the cadre on the ground to interpret and carry out. And yes, some of them undoubtedly would have taken an order like that to mean, look out for those enemies from the previous regime. They are highly suspect. And if you had people that were from the cities that had been moved around and perhaps they had an educated background, that was a reason to send them to be interrogated and most likely killed. I have no doubt that sometimes the decision may have been made to target someone like that on the basis that they were just wearing eyeglasses. However, that just doesn't quite justify this blanket meme of the Khmer Rouge killed everyone with glasses. All in all, it is just something that's often shared without knowing exactly what happened, and it has kind of snowballed to the degree where people think that the Khmer Rouge's whole project was about finding and killing people with glasses. As I said, a cliche, one based on truth, but often oversimplified. The evacuations of Phnom Penh was necessary. One of the most infamous and horrifying moments of the Khmer Rouge regime occurred as they took control of the country on the 17th of April, 1975. Just hours after their young cadres entered Phnom Penh, they began to order everyone to leave. Residents were told to pack lightly, that they'd be back in 3 days, maybe a week. Some were told it was for their own safety, that the Americans were going to bomb the city. More than 2 million people, locals and refugees that had fled there from the Civil War, were forced into the countryside. Many died along the way. They were not provided any food, water, or shelter. This so-called evacuation became more like a death march during the hottest month of the year. The sick, elderly, and children were most likely to succumb. The Khmer Rouge stood by and corralled this great caravan of human misery, in John Swain's words, to their destinations across the country. The journey took several weeks for some of these evacuees. However, this was not some chaotic, desperate measure made up on the spot. The evacuation had been planned for months. It was definitely not about protecting the people of Phnom Penh. Pol Pot gave conflicting justifications that the city was starving, that the US was going to attack. Neither was true. First of all, there was food in the city that could have been accessed and distributed. But even if we accept that there was a dire situation and the population required urgent access to food supplies, well then it would hardly make sense to get them all to pack up and walk out into the countryside. You'd keep them in the city and bring food to them. The second reason that the US was going to attack, another lie. They knew that Congress had halted the bombing since 1973, a full 2 years prior. They also knew that the Americans weren't going to bomb the city because just 2 days after ordering the evacuation, the leadership of the party, including Pol Pot, made their way into the city and established a headquarters at the train station. Again, doesn't make too much sense to go to the place you thought was going to be bombed, right? Similarly, cadres have come out and said that they were told to tell civilians in Phnom Penh anything they needed to make sure they left, including the idea that the Americans were going to bomb. It was a scare tactic. So what was the real reason behind the evacuation? Well, it's pretty simple. It certainly wasn't about helping anyone except the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot made one of the reasons clear with some Chinese journalists when he said that it was aimed to help destroy enemy spy organizations. Essentially, the idea being that if the population had remained, any networks of resistance would have also remained intact and could have attempted to subvert the new regime. This would explain why the checkpoints that people were forced through in their exodus were being used to filter out noticeable enemies of the regime, like Lon Nol officials or members of the army. These people were quickly taken away and executed. The other aims were ideological. The evacuation of Phnom Penh served to make the urban population destitute. They now had nothing. They could be remade into the ideal revolutionary like the party wanted. And if they couldn't attain that, they would be killed. It was the start of a complete inversion of the social hierarchy, making Cambodia classless, and those that were too weak to make the journey were left behind. Now, at the time, the Khmer Rouge defended this in the same way. They said it was necessary to feed the population, to get everyone to work in the fields to build up the country, except those that they were murdering along the way, of course. And it just so happened that these lines of defense were actually parroted by sympathetic Western academics and journalists. And even when refugees started escaping and speaking of the horrors that were going on, they were dismissed by these people who wanted this newest socialist revolution to be a success. And anything bad that was coming out of it was just Western propaganda. or anything bad was actually the fault of the Americans. You'll no doubt have heard that the most famous person who was peddling this opinion was Noam Chomsky. Today, you will still see the idea that the evacuations were necessary trotted out in the most fringe areas of the socialist forums of the internet. So the Khmer Rouge lies have still managed to convince a few people, even 50 years later. The Vietnamese invaded Cambodia to save Cambodia. This is another claim that's almost true, that Vietnam invaded democratic Kampuchea out of a humanitarian concern, that they had to put an end to the horrors occurring under their former comrades' rule and save Cambodia from this twisted version of socialism that they were attempting. And let's be extremely clear up front. Yes, Vietnam's invasion in late 1978 brought an end to the Khmer Rouge regime. On January 7th, 1979, Phnom Penh fell. The Khmer Rouge leadership fled west to the Thai border, bringing as much of their forces as they could. The mass killings, forced labour, all of the most prominent horrors of the regime came to a halt. There is no denying that. Vietnam ended democratic Kampuchea, and that was a very good thing. In other words, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia had the result of a humanitarian intervention, but it was not the reason that they invaded. Vietnam invaded because they were at war with the Khmer Rouge. There had been years of escalating tensions on the border, including disputes over territory, while Pol Pot and other leaders, particularly Nguyen Chea, Son Sen, Tha Mok and Ieng Sari, were convinced that there were plots by Vietnamese to assassinate them and find more pliant replacements. In fact, Pol Pot had begun to see evidence for these plots going all the way back to at least 1970, and he was only hearing more confirmation of these stories as even senior members of the party began to be arrested and sent to S21. Under conditions of torture, they would explain all kinds of concocted stories of their subversion, naming names and details of plots. This led to more arrests and more killings. Soon whole regions were being purged from the top down, particularly in the East Zone, where it was thought that the Vietnamese had always had more of an influence over Khmer Rouge cadre. Soon, cross-border raids were targeting civilian villages and massacres took place, like in Ba Chuk, where more than 3,000 people were killed by the Khmer Rouge army in April 1978. The Vietnamese leaders decided enough was enough, and by this point many Khmer Rouge themselves had defected over the border, worried that they too would be targeted in the internal purges being carried out. Then the invasion came. By this point, the Vietnamese had known what was going on next door for years. Refugees had told them, defectors had told them, but that didn't push them into action earlier. Philip Short really illustrates this well in his biography of Pol Pot. He has a section where he explains that in 1979, once the Vietnamese had toppled the regime, well, most Cambodians saw them as liberators, simply because the Khmer Rouge had been so unspeakably bad. Vietnam capitalized on this perception, and they framed their invasion as a humanitarian mission to free Cambodians from genocide. But in reality, they acted only when Pol Pot's regime became a threat to their national interests, not out of concern for the atrocities going on in Cambodia. Still, the image of a humanitarian intervention shaped both international opinion and, temporarily, views within Cambodia. Now, in utilitarian terms, this might seem like a moot point. Does it really matter why the Khmer Rouge were overthrown, as long as it happened? No, not really. No one should have said, "Hey Vietnam, don't," even though much of the West ended up doing exactly that, although we'll speak about that in a second. It was undoubtedly a very good thing that the Vietnamese invaded and toppled the Khmer Rouge regime. But when people choose to frame it in a way that somewhat distorts what their intentions really were, you have to ask, well, what is the broader point they're trying to make? The Vietnamese replaced the Khmer Rouge regime with another socialist one. They occupied the country for years, making sure the new government was very much in line with Vietnamese interests, and Cambodia did become basically a client state. It kept much of the same structure, language, and actually, lots of Khmer Rouge from the previous system were inserted into powerful positions in the new government. Re-education camps, censorship, these things didn't change. And the Vietnamese didn't have to do that. Was all of this part of saving Cambodia? Which actually goes to show why so many Cambodians decided to flee this new Vietnamese-backed regime and go to the refugee camps, even though they had pretty awful conditions, because there they had a chance of living abroad. They didn't want to live under another communist government. The United States or the CIA supported Pol Pot or the Khmer Rouge. Now, this one comes up a lot, particularly on Reddit. Someone will say something about the Khmer Rouge, it could be anything, and, it'll usually be some horrible thing they did. Someone else will chime in saying they went to the killing fields on holiday. Someone else will say something about the Dead Kennedys song, and then someone will then add to all of this really good discussion the cold, hard fact that, and did you know that the United States supported Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge? Now, all of that's fine, I'm not going to have a go at anyone there, that's just how people talk. However, one thing that I have begun to notice is that people, generally speaking, don't really give any extra context or understanding of that last bit. They will just say, the United States supported the Khmer Rouge. Now, if someone doesn't follow that up with this very important qualifier of when did they do this and how was this support provided, well, then you've got a pretty misleading little comment just hanging out there, right? And I think it's been shared enough, and people don't have the attention spans to actually look things up and check sources anymore, that I think enough people have probably seen that and have begun just walking away thinking that the US supported the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot during their time in power. So let's be very clear about this. Did the US support the Khmer Rouge from 1970 to 1978? No. They bombed half of Cambodia trying to kill them in the first half of the 1970s, and then once the Americans left Vietnam and Cambodia in 1975, they were pretty happy to forget that part of the world existed. No support there. In fact, no one even in the country. It was closed off. However, once the Khmer Rouge were removed from power in 1979, that's when things became a little more interesting again for the White House. Because now there was a new regime in Cambodia, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, installed by the Vietnamese, as we said before, who were occupying the country with tens of thousands of troops. From the perspective of Cold War geopolitics, this was a problem, mostly for China, who had kept the Khmer Rouge close as a kind of potential barrier for Vietnamese dominating all of Indochina right on the Chinese doorstep. As we said, Vietnam were aligned with the Soviets, and the Chinese, since they had their own deep issues with the Soviets for the last 25 years or so, well, to cut a long story short, they weren't keen on this situation at all. Not happy enough that they briefly went to war with the Vietnamese as a kind of punishment for unseating their ally, Pol Pot. Now, how does the United States get involved in all this? Well, aside from the attractive proposition of painting the Vietnamese as the aggressor in an illegal invasion against a sovereign Cambodia, they had also been developing stronger ties with the Chinese since Nixon opened up relations in the early 1970s. So, in a nutshell, the US was trying to support their new friend and punish their enemy, and isolate the Soviet Union at the same time. This is where the phrase, the US supported the Khmer Rouge, comes from, which is probably not nearly enough of a damnation for what this really was. This was truly dreadful, a despicable example of realpolitik. The US, along with China and some ASEAN nations, began supporting a coalition of anti-Vietnamese resistance forces along the Thai-Cambodian border. This group, called the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea, included three main factions: the Royalists, loyal to Sihanouk, the Khmer People's National Liberation Front, a more moderate Republican group, and yes, the remnants of the Khmer Rouge. The US did not directly arm the Khmer Rouge either, but they did provide aid, more than $80 million between 1980 and 1986, ostensibly for humanitarian purposes, much of it channeled through the United Nations and non-governmental organizations. In practice, this helped sustain the border war. It also helped legitimize the Khmer Rouge's continued presence on the international stage. And that's one of the most embarrassing things about it all, is like we talked about how the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and set up this regime and then stayed in the country. But one of the main reasons they had to stay was to continue fighting the Khmer Rouge. They had this new front of a war that they had to keep fighting, and then you have the international community saying, well, why are you still there? And it's like, well, we have to keep fighting the Khmer Rouge, and you're now funding them to keep that war going. The whole thing is a total mess. It's embarrassing. And one of the most surreal parts of the whole thing was at the United Nations, the US and its allies voted to let the Khmer Rouge retain Cambodia's official seat. The new Vietnamese-backed government wasn't recognised. So throughout the 1980s, the official representative of Cambodia at the UN was a delegate from Pol Pot's regime, which no longer even held Phnom Penh. A US diplomat at the time reportedly described the vote as a deal with the devil. Another recalled physically wanting to wash his hands after being thanked by a Khmer Rouge representative. So no one felt good about it. This was the logic of the Cold War and the desire to punish Vietnam and by extension the Soviets, this one out. But it was this really sad example of Cambodia continuing to be this chess piece in the larger game, and no one cared about the Cambodian people themselves, who were suffering. They were being left behind developmentally and economically, and many of them were starving and living off nothing. So really terrible period of history. And when it comes down to it, the US did support Pol Pot. It was a shameful mess. But next time you see someone say, "Did you know the US supported the Khmer Rouge?" make sure to ask them when. Because without that detail, the statement can be incredibly misleading. And we wouldn't want to be intentionally misleading people just to score political points on the internet, would we? That would be crazy. Pol Pot wasn't a communist. Have you heard this? Have you seen this? Have you heard about this? So this is the quintessential example of someone's own political bias overriding common sense to try and make an argument they think will somehow protect their own side. It is done to distance the horrors of the Khmer Rouge from communism or socialism generally, and it has been argued with varying degrees of sophistication for decades. I'm going to frame this part of the video as if the person watching it had this opinion, that Pol Pot wasn't a communist, and I'll give you the reasons why I think you should change your mind, or at least consider that statement with a fuller understanding. First, I want to dispel some myths that people will often trot out when they are trying to make this claim. This is the really basic stuff where people don't really know what they're talking about, so they will often quite smugly say something like, yeah, Pol Pot didn't even read Marx. So let's put that to bed. Firstly, someone doesn't need to be a scholar of Marxist texts to be a communist, but in any case, while Pol Pot was in Paris, he and other students who were following this path toward becoming revolutionaries studied a wide variety of communist books and tracts together, including Marx's Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, Lenin's The State and Revolution, Bukharin's The ABC of Communism, Stalin's History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong's New Democracy from his selected works. They also read the magazine of the French Communist Party. So let's not kid around with the "he didn't even read communism" books. He probably read a lot more than you. Now, the extra smug answer would be, yeah, well, he didn't understand them. Okay, well, on that front, if we were ever going to cut him some slack, which is a weird thing to say about a mass murderer, but Pol Pot and the other students in Paris were reading these texts that had been translated into French. This isn't their native language. Many of these books were never translated into Khmer, and this certainly hindered their ability to understand them fully. The other rebuttal I would have to this argument is that, okay, let's say that Pol Pot wasn't the most ardent reader of Karl Marx. He was a member of the French Communist Party, and he did decide to join the Vietnamese Communist Army in 1953 while they were at war with the French, and was taught Marxist concepts and practice by Vietnamese cadre in the jungles. Does that make Pol Pot more or less of a communist in your eyes? Being trained by the supposedly heroic communist Vietnamese on how to apply these concepts and develop a revolution. So any of the keyboard warriors out there who think they are more of a communist than Pol Pot, let's see you read all the books he did, from Marx to Mao, and then let's see you go to the jungle and fight a war against the imperialist French for a couple of years, and then maybe you can have your argument about who is and who isn't a communist. So I would characterize those arguments people make as lazy sort of attacks on Pol Pot's communist credentials, like saying someone doesn't have the requisite expertise to call themselves something. The next line of arguments they will lay out are generally cherry-picked quotes or phrases, sometimes not even attributed to Pol Pot but to other Khmer Rouge leaders, and a bit like the US supported the Khmer Rouge argument, they are usually not given with a specific timing, which is very important. So one that people love to trot out is from Ieng Sary in 1977. Ieng Sary was very high up in the Khmer Rouge leadership and often served as their kind of frontman. He was actually one of the intellectual leaders as well from their time in Paris, and one of the most educated and committed communists from the late 1940s onwards. But anyway, the quote that people take from him was, "We're not communists, we are revolutionaries, who do not belong to the commonly accepted grouping of communist Indochina." Now, again, no one ever bothers to check sources or the context of anything, but this was stated at a meeting of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it was an attempt to try and distance the Khmer Rouge from Vietnam and try and form alliances with other non-communist countries against the Vietnamese. That was the reason that they said that they weren't communist like the Vietnamese are communists. Context is very important, particularly with the Khmer Rouge, who would say anything, including very contradictory things, to make themselves look good or to try and make someone else look bad. This also happened to a greater extent once they were removed from power, so in the 80s and 90s, when the leaders tried to make themselves seem more palatable to the West that had grossly decided to support them. This is when you get them saying that they had given up communism. But that wasn't true, by the way. Pol Pot was always a committed communist. So let's compare what another senior leader said about what the Khmer Rouge were trying to achieve when they were in power. This is what Khieu Samphan and Son Sen told Sihanouk that the aims of the party were in 1975. Cambodia's name would be written in gold letters in world history as the first country that succeeded in communization without useless steps. Overall, there are dozens of quotes that people could use that would clearly indicate the Khmer Rouge considered themselves to be communists for every one quote that people found that seems to make that claim look a little watered down. But what did Pol Pot himself have to say? Well, there's no shortage of quotes that people could use here, but let's pick out a few. For example, we have the 1976 speech that Pol Pot made upon the death of Mao. There he stated publicly that Cambodia was run by his party, a Marxist-Leninist organization that had learned much from Mao's writings. Later, he would say about the victory they achieved in 1975, he said that the US imperialist retreat in panic from Kampuchea was filmed and shown to the whole world. Never before had there been such an event in the annals of the world's revolutionary wars. In one word, the great victory won by our people and revolutionary army under the leadership of the Communist Party of Kampuchea has become a precious model for the world's peoples. The world's revolutionary movement and the international communist movement. Various party histories written by the likes of Pol Pot or Nuon Chea, state that at party congresses, the members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, as if, by the way, that wasn't a clue, the name of their party, but anyway, they would approve a political strategy, and Marxist, Leninist statutes were always approved for the party in how they would operate. Similarly, one of the most important documents to actually survive the regime was the results of a meeting held by the party that sought to basically set out the plan for what they were going to do now that they were in complete control of the country. It was called the party's 4-year plan to build socialism in all fields, and it's part of a collection of documents edited together, and it is a must read for anyone who wants to know anything about the Khmer Rouge, and it really actually sets out their agenda and their ideology in their own words. So if you want to know what the Khmer Rouge ideology was, rather than just saying what it wasn't, you should read this collection of documents first. Now, the party's 4-year plan to build socialism in all fields. One of these documents. Again, as if the title isn't giving away the ideology, I don't really know what words are supposed to mean anymore if that doesn't give you an indication of what the ideology was. But this document is also key because it states what the aims were and the character of their party was. Look at what they say about their own leadership. Certainly, our party doesn't hesitate. We didn't go through a period of land reform or social change. Instead, we leaped from a people's democratic revolution into socialism. Our line is correct, both in terms of strategy and tactics. Further on, they clue you into some examples they look up to. Lenin carried out a revolution with empty hands. We did the same thing. We made a revolution in difficulties and with empty hands. But we had a clear line and a firm standpoint. We made a revolution and we beat our enemies. We also have this section that neatly outlines what the Khmer Rouge were trying to do. And it wasn't to go back to the Middle Ages, as some people incorrectly suggest as another reason they weren't communists. No, it was this: to build socialism in agriculture, to raise the people's standard of living quickly, to rapidly expand agriculture, industry, and defense. They wanted to build socialism in the industrial sector, to build light industry, then fund heavy industry. They wanted to make an advanced communist country, initially based off agricultural production, and this was all laid out by them. This was their super great leap forward. Now, you will still get people at this point who will say, yeah, well, he wasn't an orthodox Marxist though. Cambodia didn't have enough of an industrial sector to begin with. Therefore, they didn't have enough of the proletariat class. So their revolution was always going to be backward. And this was something that was lobbed by, say, the Vietnamese communists toward their Cambodian comrades in the early 1950s. Not to mention all of the internecine arguments and name-calling that the various strands of communists have taken since, when the Soviets were the only good communists and everyone else was a revisionist, or the Maoists calling everyone else reactionary, and then there are, even more pure group that consider everyone else except just Marx to be wrong, and the philosophers in the 50s, and on it goes. And you'll get other people who want to talk about 19th century German economics, and look, I just don't have time for any of that. This is a common sense approach I'm providing here. When someone says that Pol Pot wasn't a communist, I think we can have a common sense answer to that. But it is where I will acknowledge that you do come up against some more sophisticated arguments, people that are very familiar with the ins and outs of Marxist theory, and perhaps not just the people LARPing as communists online and unironically calling each other comrade. This is why I couldn't take that podcast series Blowback seriously as well. Their subreddit is all just a bunch of people saying how cool Stalin was. But anyway, arguing with self-proclaimed communists can be annoying because they will sometimes play games of moving the goalposts and might eventually decide to dodge the entire debate about whether Pol Pot was a communist by saying that Mao wasn't a communist, Stalin wasn't a communist, Lenin wasn't a communist. In fact, no communism has ever been tried, even by the self-titled socialist countries in the 20th century. To that argument, I don't have much to say, except, well, can we at least say that those revolutions are trying to be communist? Can we agree on that? I don't know. I don't know if people would. You actually have similar points made by some historians of Cambodia. One of those is Michael Vickery. He will often get selectively quoted by people defending the Khmer Rouge or by those wanting to make the point that they weren't communists. You always want to be a little bit careful when you see people using Vickery as their only source. People usually don't recognize that Vickery himself was a Maoist and was doing what a lot of leftists did in the 80s, which was that whole let's distance the Khmer Rouge from the real communist thing. But he himself has a telling quote about what we consider this whole history of communist revolutions in the 20th century argument. He said that Cambodia was even further from the ideal situation for a transition to socialism than Russia, Eastern Europe, or China. There was very little industry or the natural resources to develop it, and the country was just about as complete a peasant society as could be found. On the other hand, however, all revolutionary changes which have resulted in regimes termed socialist or communist either by themselves or by their enemies have occurred in societies which were not in the stage of advanced capitalism and show features, particularly in the political instance, which would have shocked the founders of scientific socialism. Which is a great point. He is a great scholar, but I think overall, if anyone is having this argument and they do consider that, say, Mao or Stalin or Lenin or Ho Chi Minh, if any of those guys were communists, then I would have to contend that Pol Pot is just as deserving to be among that list. All those men took the ideas of Marxism and applied them in different ways to the realities they were facing. They developed Marxism into their own culture and they made it their own. And Pol Pot certainly fits into that category, as he is quoted in Philip Short's biography saying, "Marxism-Leninism resides within the movements forged by the people, and the people's movement in each country puts together its own Marxism-Leninism. We applied ourselves to define a direction and then to put it into practice without knowing whether it was right or wrong. There was no model, no blueprint, but rather a mixture of influences. A little of this and a little of that." So what he's saying there is that the Cambodian communists took influence from all kinds of different socialist revolutions and made their own version. They made it work in the Cambodian context. In essence, they made a Cambodian communism. Now, that quote from Pol Pot, that doesn't necessarily get across the whole picture either. Someone like Steve Hedder, in his book Cambodian Communism and the Vietnamese Model, makes an entire book out of making the case that the Cambodian communists really just kept copying the Vietnamese communists, who set up everything from the beginning and taught them most of what they knew. But because of the tensions between the Cambodians and the Vietnamese, Pol Pot was never likely to say that, yes, we did have a blueprint, and you know where we got it from? The Vietnamese. So we can't always take him at his word either. But overall, within what Pol Pot said about taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that, that's the crux of the argument. Either Pol Pot wasn't an orthodox Marxist that followed everything Marx laid out, in which case no leader of a socialist country has ever been a communist, or you have to concede that communism isn't just one thing. It can be built upon or applied in different ways and in different contexts. As Khieu Samphan, a senior member of the Khmer Rouge with, I might add, a PhD on Marxism's application to Cambodia, one of a few doctorate-level ideological influences on Pol Pot and the ideology of the Khmer Rouge as a whole. So, Pol Pot wasn't the only leader, right? People disingenuously use his supposed lack of reading marks or his lack of education as a sign that the Khmer Rouge weren't communists, without considering the ones that had PhDs applying Marxist theory. But anyway, Sampan's own rebuttal of this argument that the Khmer Rouge weren't communists is as such. It's true that the Cambodian Communist Party was based on the poor peasantry rather than the working class, but you cannot use that as an argument for saying it was not a Marxist party, or that there was no economic basis for a communist party in Cambodia. In fact, we applied the criterion of material conditions quite correctly, because the poor peasants were the most impoverished, the most oppressed class in Cambodian society. And it was this class that was the foundation of the Cambodian Party. So again, that's a guy with a PhD defending the idea that the Khmer Rouge were communist. But if someone is still resistant to this idea, basically if your argument is that what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia couldn't have been in line with communism because their material conditions weren't what Marx said they should be, well, sorry. But then we are just back at that point of, I guess, there have been no socialist revolutions in the 20th century because none of them have come out of a capitalist society, which is what Marx predicted was the progression of history, right? And then we're back to the tired cliche of true communism has never been achieved. And, well, if that's your opinion, and I'm not going to be able to change it, that's fine. But I think we could also agree that a lot of people have tried to bring a communist society into being, and in trying to do so, they've killed a lot of people along the way. So if you know better than all of those that came before you, that read all the books, made their little revolutionary parties and gave it a good go, well, everyone is very impressed by you. But I think people are far too smug, thinking they know more about communism than Pol Pot. Pol Pot could recite French poetry. He was a teacher. He studied a hell of a lot of communist books. He wasn't as stupid as some people try to make out, which actually makes it a lot scarier. He was a smart guy. He had even smarter guys in his party. And more than that, everyone remembered him as a really nice guy, with a charming, smooth way of speaking. He was a compassionate teacher, and yet the ideology he had adopted still led him to decide to take the revolution in Cambodia into a direction that led to more than a quarter of the population dying in under 4 years. So the last argument I will make to those that remain unconvinced is that I think it is very patronizing and even bordering on racist sometimes to tell the Cambodian Communist Party that they weren't actually communists, that you somehow know better, despite many of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge having joined the French Communist Party, some of them getting advanced degrees on Marxist theory, involving themselves in a party that was fighting wars against so-called imperialist armies, developing a socialist plan to take over their countries and implement a class-based revolution. If you're going to stand up and say, no, they didn't understand Marxism, it's like, who do you think you are? Do you get to do the same thing when self-proclaiming Christian fundamentalists blow up an abortion clinic? Do you say, well, that person really wasn't a Christian because they didn't read the Bible like they should have? Or when an Islamic fundamentalist kills a bunch of innocent people, do you stand there and say, no, that person didn't think about the Quran in the right way, and so therefore they aren't a Muslim? No. You say they're bad people. You say they're bad Christians or bad Muslims. But you don't deny that their faith was real. You have to listen to what people say they are. You can't just tell them what they're actually thinking. So if you are one of those people that consider yourself a Marxist or a communist or whatever, then you should at least have the humility to say, yeah, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were trying to do a communist revolution, and it was a massive failure. It was horrible. You should condemn them as bad communists, not deny that they were communists in the first place. But I think I'll just leave this argument with a line from one of the biographies that have been written about Pol Pot, and I'm writing my own at the moment, so if you're watching this in the future when it has been published by Reaction Books, go out and buy it. But here is what David Chandler had to say. By 1951, if not before, he, Pol Pot, was caught up in a wave of optimism about the potentialities of the communist movement. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Salazar never abandoned communism or regretted his decision. Instead, he made a lifelong commitment to the cause. The death toll of the Khmer Rouge has been exaggerated. Okay, now on this one we are moving away from mere political bias and selective evidence into claims that are in the realms of denialism and just outright lies. The idea that the death toll inflicted by the Khmer Rouge was exaggerated is a pretty egregious one. Saying that it was a lie is even worse. However, what I will say is that as a result of the policies that the Khmer Rouge inflicted on Cambodia, such as the closing of the borders, constantly lying about everything, starting a war with Vietnam, and then continuing a war for almost 2 decades once they were ousted from power, and then you factor in that the Khmer Rouge regime came on the back of at least 5 years of civil war, and right next door to the Vietnam War, well, let's just say that numbers, accurate numbers, were naturally going to be hard to really nail down for quite a long time. And without that certainty, and with political bias going both ways, well, perhaps it is no wonder that there have been different takes on how many people died over the course of the history about this tragic period of history. But if there is a leniency there on people's attempts to calculate the numbers of people that died, well, that leniency doesn't extend to people that are trying to play the same games with numbers and trying to diminish them over the last 20 years or so. I think the best way to go through this is to start with what the best numbers actually are now, and then we can examine why people want to twist them or invent reasons why they were false. Now, if you're watching this, and if you want the best source, I think the most agreed upon and most useful source about the death toll inflicted by the Khmer Rouge, or indeed that occurred during the Civil War, like if you're a student or if you're looking to disprove something you've seen someone say online, this is the source that you should be referring to. This is the expert demographer's report produced by the Khmer Rouge tribunals for the trial of the remaining leaders. It goes through all of the previous attempts to calculate the death toll since the 1980s and examines their strengths and weaknesses, then uses all the data possible to come to the most likely figures of how many people died. This includes statistical analysis as well as all of the data that has come out of, say, exhuming mass graves in Cambodia, something I briefly worked on and wrote a couple of reports on when I was working as an intern for the Documentation Center of Cambodia. It's basically the most up-to-date thing that you could use, this demographer's report, and I consider it to be the gold standard that people should be using from this point onward. So, what was the death toll? Well, all of this data is given on page 70 of the report, and we can go through it together. How does that sound? So regarding the most likely estimates that we've identified in this report, the following can be reported. Population as of April 1975, meaning when the Khmer Rouge took over the whole country and the war ended, between 7.8 million and 8.1 million, most likely around 7.8 million. Population in January 79, meaning when the Khmer Rouge regime was removed, 6 to 6.5 million people, most likely around 6.2 million. Next, it has this calculation of the death toll during the Civil War, which is very interesting because you will see some people making huge unsubstantiated claims about how many people died and therefore how many people were killed by the US bombing campaign. So the figure given here is most likely 250,000 dead, including civilian and military, but between 150,000 or 310,000, somewhere in that range. That is a big difference to what you might commonly see, which I've seen it as high as 500,000, even more. Now, If we just remain on the Civil War death toll, again this is from like 1970 to 1975, before the Khmer Rouge come to power. If we just keep here, this also means that someone like Ben Kiernan's estimations of how many people were killed by the US bombing being more than 150,000 or so, something like the figure he gives in an article he wrote in 2006, where he also mistakenly calculated the gross tonnage of the bombs dropped on the country to be like 1.5 million tons more than that was actually dropped. Well, that would mean that his estimated numbers of how many people were killed are also a lot higher than what was likely to have occurred. So, if the entire death toll was around 250,000, it's very unlikely that 150,000 were killed by the bombing. In fact, the most common cited figure now for that death toll from the bombing is actually around 50,000. Now, if we're moving along slightly, we get to the most important numbers for our discussion. How many people were killed under the Khmer Rouge? Most likely 1.75 million to 2.2 million. So if you were to put a number in between that, you would likely be correct. If you went with 2 million people dead, I don't think any historian would suggest otherwise. Another key data point they state here is how many of those that died were the result of violent deaths, meaning how many were murdered by the Khmer Rouge as opposed to dying from overwork or disease, and they give a number that is likely 50% of the total, so in excess of 1 million direct executions. I will leave a link to this document in the video description if you want to pick up your own copy. It's very handy to have if you're engaged in this field. So why do people lie about these numbers? Well, let's actually start with the examples where the numbers actually have been exaggerated. For instance, many of you watching this will have likely been to Cambodia. If so, you've likely visited the Chongek killing field outside of Phnom Penh, where the largest memorial to the victims of the regime was created. Now, I went through my photos of all of the trips I've made to Cambodia over the years, and I could have sworn that on the first few occasions I went, there was a plaque of sort of dedicated to the memory of the victims, and I could have been sure that I saw that it said the victims of the Khmer Rouge were 3 million deaths. Now, I've not been able to find that plaque, I've not been able to see that photo. I can't tell if my memory is actually mixing something up there and I've just seen that figure, or it was actually an old plaque from like the 80s or 90s. Either way, my point is that when the Vietnamese-backed PRK regime was constructing monuments and memorials like this, they had decided on using that 3 million deaths as the correct number for some time. Now, how they came to that number and whether they knew they were exaggerating, I'm not sure, but it was definitely within their interest to make sure the death toll was as high as possible, because that legitimized their invasion of Cambodia to topple the Khmer Rouge, and it also legitimized their continuing stay in the country and the legitimacy of the new government that they had set up. The new government gets to say, we're keeping the Khmer Rouge out, they killed 3 million people, we're protecting you. This number is still seen in the official government-backed media outlets like the Khmer Times, who on the most recent celebration of the liberation of Cambodia that occurs on January 7th every year, Victory Day, well, this article from 2025 states that the invasion rescued more than 5 million Cambodians from the brutal genocidal regime of the Khmer Rouge, which killed more than 3 million innocent people. Now, the politics of the whole Vietnam, current Cambodian political party thing, that's a whole other discussion, but the short answer is, like I said, making the Khmer Rouge out to be as bad as possible is certainly within their interest. And it's not like they even really need to exaggerate. It was one of the worst things that ever happened, but still. So when people say that the death toll has been exaggerated, like if they're looking at the state propaganda of the PRK regime, they have a point. It might not be a point made with the best intent, but nonetheless they could show you some facts and figures to prove they were right. In fact, we could do that right now. We could say that number is an exaggeration based on the current number that scholars and experts say was the number, 2 million. However, it's one thing to say actually current numbers indicate that it wasn't 3 million that were killed but closer to 2 million. That's one thing. That's just good historical accuracy. But it's another thing entirely to look at that 2 million number that we talked about and say that that number has been grossly exaggerated. So one of the most famous examples of attempting to seriously dispute the idea that millions were killed by the Khmer Rouge was done by the aforementioned historian Michael Vickery. As I said, Vickery is a really smart guy, or was a really smart guy. He spent decades in Cambodia. He made some very important contributions to the study of Cambodian history. I'm not in any kind of position to say that he wasn't a great scholar. However, his political leanings definitely impacted his work on the Cambodian Revolution. I'll just kind of leave it at that. In terms of the death toll that he came to, and which you will see referenced by others who want to selectively use his data to prove their point that the Khmer Rouge numbers weren't that bad, well, for instance, he said that the number of excess deaths in that 4 years was actually just 740,000, and that the number that were actually outright killed by the Khmer Rouge was 300,000. Now, obviously, this is significantly lower than can be accepted as realistic. As the expert demographer report suggests, Vickery's results have no source foundation other than subjective guessing and his own intuition. His reasoning is simplistic and assumptions completely unjustified. Any other attempt at similarly downplaying the number that died is following in this, in my opinion, farcical and grotesque game of allowing their biases to guide their hand, invent numbers that aren't there and make them suit their agenda. It's as simple as that. Now, the worst offender in this regard is none other than Pol Pot himself, who said in a document released by the Khmer Rouge in the late 1980s that only 30,000 deaths might have occurred under his regime. He also said that S-21 was a complete fabrication invented by the Vietnamese, and the more than 10,000 people that were sent there to die, that was all lies. So if you see someone saying that the death toll was exaggerated, now you know why they are making that claim and what their sources are and what those sources were trying to do when they made that claim. And they're probably echoing the thoughts of the person who perpetrated the crimes themselves. Someone looking to make them seem less significant. And in my eyes, that is tantamount to genocide denial. Pol Pot was a nationalist hero. Okay, here we are with perhaps the most shocking entry on the list, that Pol Pot is actually a good man, a hero. Now, I realise there are some trolls out there online, and not every example of this coming up in comment sections and everything like that is genuine, although, you can't quite judge the level of sarcasm or irony being employed by nameless people on the internet, but we can actually look to real life people, in Cambodia no less, who actually hold these similarly positive views about the man who almost destroyed their country and killed more than a quarter of its people. There's a fascinating article in The Diplomat from 2018, Patriot, Lucky Spirit, Villain, Pol Pot Remembered, and the journalist visited the last stronghold of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where Pol Pot died in 1998, An Long Veng. He was cremated there and his grave still remains. Now, perhaps it wouldn't surprise you to know that you can still find former Khmer Rouge living there and in other parts of the country who still think quite fondly of Pol Pot. He's remembered by them as a patriot, a kind teacher, and someone who fought to keep Cambodia out of the hands of the Vietnamese. Some of them still have doubts about how many people were killed and think that even if there were thousands and thousands that died, it probably wasn't Pol Pot's fault, but it must have been, lower ranking cadre. There is even a native spiritual element to the veneration of Pol Pot, whose cremation site is still visited by people wishing to pay their respects. Ironically, some even believe that the spirit of the man who abolished currency and markets in the 1970s, if properly appeased, might grant them luck and prosperity, maybe even helping them get the correct lottery numbers. A local casino owner even comes to pay his respects in the hope that the casino will receive the kind of spiritual protection that traditional ancestor spirits can afford physical locations. While that kind of reverence might veer into a kind of Cambodian spiritual worldview, there are others that simply think that Pol Pot was doing an alright job and that the Vietnamese invaded and took over the country. They believe the propaganda that the Khmer Rouge used that portrayed the Vietnamese as Cambodia's ancient enemy. And this was a tactic used not just by Pol Pot, but also Lon Nol and Prince Sihanouk before him. For them, places like Kampuchea Krom, the area that is now part of southern Vietnam and annexed by the Vietnamese more than 200 years ago, are proof that Vietnam has always wanted to swallow up Cambodia. And I think that this underlying anxiety that many Cambodians still have about their eastern neighbours is what is at the root of any consideration of Pol Pot being other than, the worst thing that happened to their country. They saw the invasion of the Vietnamese in 1979 as proof of what Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were saying would happen. They saw the subsequent occupation as further evidence, and they saw the government that the Vietnamese installed as little more than a puppet regime. If someone had lived in one of the, relatively speaking, better off zones in democratic Kampuchea, or a village that didn't have a really bad chief, or if they weren't part of the urban classes cast out of the city, well, they might be in a position to have lived through democratic Kampuchea and have said, well, I didn't see thousands of people die. For all I know, maybe the Vietnamese did make everything up. People who have listened to the podcast will be familiar with the old Cambodian myth of the master's tea, where Khmers who were imprisoned or enslaved by the Vietnamese during the occupation of Emperor Minh Mang in the early 1800s were forced to work on the construction of a large canal. Now, the story goes that one day the Vietnamese buried 3 Khmer prisoners up to their heads in sand in the formation of a tripod. And then a little fire was lit between their heads, and then a kettle was placed on top to sort of boil, using their heads as a tripod, yeah? And when the prisoners began to thrash around in pain from the flames, the Vietnamese is portrayed as saying callously, hey, careful not to spill the master's tea. Now, this fable has had a long run in Cambodia. It was popular in the 20th century. It was even repeated by Pol Pot in his 1978 book about Vietnam. You will even still hear it today, as one of the listeners to the podcast, who lives in Cambodia, was kind enough to confirm for me. So this is the legacy of, ethnic hatred, I suppose. And the Cambodian-Vietnamese dynamic cannot be removed from any discussion about the Khmer Rouge. It is just this fundamental aspect of the history, even to Khmer nationalism. And that is why, even today, you will still hear some people in Cambodia defending Pol Pot's reputation, indeed calling him a hero. Okay, so that is my list of 10 facts that people still think are true about Cambodia that are either false, hugely distorted, or oversimplified cliches. Did you think I missed something? Was I too harsh? Not harsh enough? Not balanced? Too even-handed? Let me know in the comments. Do you see any parallels with current conversations about contemporary events or politics? Because I do, but I'll leave that up to you to decide what I'm talking about. Now, if you are new to this channel, first and foremost, I'm a student of Cambodian history. I've been studying this since I was in high school, and I'm in my mid-30s now. So I've created the most in-depth podcast about the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge. It is called In the Shadows of Utopia. It isn't 3 people discussing the Wikipedia and having a joke, or including overly grotesque facts sandwiched in between cute animal stories to soften the blow. And it isn't just, an AI reading something, nor is it an attempt to say that the whole thing was just Henry Kissinger's fault. So if you are interested in the history of the Khmer Rouge, from someone that wants to tell the whole story, you should subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Or you can listen to it on YouTube as well if you want, but most people listen to it on, a podcast provider. I've been doing it for like 8 years by this point. I'm currently writing my first book on the topic. So again, if this is the future, when that book has been released, well, I'll be very happy that I won't have to work on it anymore. But please consider buying it or listening to it on Audible. And if you see someone sharing one of the facts I've tried to explain in this video, well, why not refer them to this video? Because the more people that know about this tragic period of history, I think that is for the better, and we can try and move away from just using the same old tired cliches to explain what happened in Cambodia, and we can actually look to talk about this in a rounded way and not just this oversimplified narrative. I've also got a Patreon with lots of bonus stuff there, so check that out as well if you want. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.